What's up, guys? I'm going to come in and I'm finishing this texture up with what I think is the last relevant line to look at. It's going to be when we check and in position checks back behind us. So for the model, I still have the check range lock on for out of position, and I'm just going to have in position check back, and I'm going to toggle through a bunch of rivers, and we're going to look at potential exploitative strategies for reopening river. One thing I want to show you guys right off the bat, I made an aggregational report for choosing a river card like you have to do before you can pump out any aggregational report. Usually we learned how to do that on the turn, but this is the first time I did it for the river in Pack 2, and this is what it looks like. It'll take longer to run down here. You'll see it's counting up to like 2200 simulations or something instead of just like 47. That's because what it's doing is pumping out every single combination of turn and possible river together. So a couple disclaimers. At first, this would make it seem like it would be really valuable in terms of getting the average equity pushes, in terms of how much equity is out of position pushing to the river after the turn goes check check. What are the general EV averages here? It appears that out of position is at a slight EV disadvantage, and he also is at a slight hot and cold asymmetry disadvantage. The problem with caring too much about this aggregational report is, remember, it's only locked for the specific king of diamonds. So where we're going to be checking our range on a lot of cards, this thing has us balancing a c-betting range for a lot of these cards that it's pumping out. You can see the differences, I guess, between the overall c-bet frequency, where the average would be a mix of the 24.8% two-thirds bet and the 5.2% all in. So overall we check 69.8% of the time, as opposed to here where this is a lock for check range, so our get to river is way stronger, and we're using the all in like quite a bit because we're way less capped, and it looks like we're betting closer to 50% here. If we wanted to look at the average EV before any river comes down, we want to highlight the check node. It doesn't matter that the deuce is already up here. As long as we're highlighting the check node, we can get the average EVs across all rivers, and we see that with our check range, on the king of diamonds in particular, in position is ahead here, 187 to 160. So just pointing that out as a general indicator that you can't really use the aggregational report relevantly here because it's not conducive to the strategy that we're applying. It's going to show you basically for using a c-bet strategy, and there's no way to lock for all turn check range, which sucks, but we can still manually explore relevantly, which is what we're going to do here. So we have this general idea that we're allowed to bet more aggressively on account of the fact that our checking range is out of position is stronger than it was at optimal. What I want to do is, in a similar fashion that we've been doing, explore how MDF challenged in position is in this line after the turn goes check check and he faces like a two-thirds river bet, which I think is the most relevant option just in terms of standardization of our strategy, wanting to polarize. And I could add different options, but I'm certainly not going to like 4x overbet. I just think it's not all that necessary in terms of getting the exploit across that we want to get, while still having a relatively standardized system where we can show that we're balancing it at least somewhat with front door value. So what we want is sort of like this under the radar river aggression strategy here, where like we are showing up with the value bets, but we are just using too many bluffs and putting a little bit too much pressure on him. So the reason that I am advocating that we're going to be barreling exploitatively wide with bluffs across pretty much a lot of different rivers is because I think that in position is fairly MDF challenged here. If we take a look at what his defense is on a deuce in this spot, he's pretty much got to defend all of his king x. He gets to fold some of his 9x, which is reasonable, but he's also calling a decent amount of the low pocket pair. I think there's a lot of pressure on these hands, and they habitually fold to a river reopen. So there's that going on. And then as a boost, remember that in positions also bluff raising like perfectly. The environments are not going to be bluff raising nearly enough, especially on cards that don't interact well with their range. So remember we had him locked for the optimal check back the environment actually is checking back the same frequency, but we could also argue that the environment is likely checking back a more capped range than this, because is the environment really checking back as much two pair here? Two pair plus? Maybe. I mean, maybe he checks back like something like 20% of his sets and 10% of his ace-9 two pair and ace-4 two pair. But it's another thing to think about when we're trying to devise confidence intervals for how assumptive laden our get-to-river strategies are. So we'll just say, for simplification purposes, that this is actually what our villain's river range looks like. My argument is that he can't really defend all that comfortably if he's not also bluff raising efficiently. For every bluff raise that he misses, for instance, if his overall raising range here ends up being something like 6 or 7%, it's because he's probably missed his bluff raises. Let's assume he's not missing a value raise, although he could be, because this ace jack is fairly thin. I think a lot of guys would be missing that. The point is that for every bluff raise that he doesn't correctly find, he has to call with that hand as opposed to fold it in order to meet an MDF. It's not a very easy thing to do, and I think what happens is that most guys will, instead of putting their bluff raises into the call, will instead shift it over to the fold. So it makes it harder for them to reach their MDF if they're not bluff raising accurately, which I think is a relevant point because we see that start to happen fairly often across pretty much all rivers. So the 3 is going to be relatively similar just based on the patterning of the range versus range interaction. Let's look at something more connected, like maybe an 8. So here we see in position bluff raising even more aggressively, raising more aggressively overall, and it's because it interacts better with his range. He picks up more two pair, but when I say he's bluff raising more aggressively overall, I'm again referring to that Bayesian base rate concept that he's gonna have to pull the trigger with more bluffs if he wants to approach that 16% raising rate. So here I'm basically looking for how challenged he is. Again, he's still having to felt a decent amount of 9x. He's able to fold some king x in this spot, which is not all that alluring to me as far as trying to get him to fold too much. I don't like to see that he's allowed to fold king x, I guess is what I mean to say. But he's still forced to felt a decent amount of 9x versus a bet, and again he's choosing these 7 6s 5s and 5 4 suited to fill out the rest of his range, which if we pushed it up, again I mentioned that absolute value type terminology that I sometimes use to visualize this better. If we pushed it up, we could say that he's likely forced to defend all of his king x and probably at least half of his 9x. And that's if he's bluff raising perfectly, which is assumptive, I think, for the environment, highly assumptive. So we could probably say that some of these bluff raises, for instance, it looks like he's actually like bluff raising some of the king 6, king 5. So he would actually have to be calling all of those instead of turning them into bluffs to begin with, which is not all that easy. Looks like that's his main bluff that he's using, is he's turning king x into bluffs. I really don't see another combination that he's using, which is interesting for this grid that he's choosing that as his main blocker. But if we saw a weaker hand, like I was expecting to see maybe some 9x get bluffed, you can see the shreds of queen 9. And if he misses the queen 9 bluff raise, it's more likely going to get turned into a fold than a call, as far as the environmental trend, because that's just the passivity trend of what I see on a regular basis. It's harder to pull the trigger on the bluff raise than it is to click fold with the marginal hand. So that helps us in terms of getting a fold equity boost on the river. So it's not like a green light to just start going psychotic, because you do generally want to keep your frequencies kind of undetectable in this line if you're playing with the same guys regularly. But I do give you permission to get a little bit more abusive with it, and if you're playing on anonymous sites, you can probably abuse it a ton, especially since on those sites guys tend to overfold substantially versus this reopen line. I'm talking about the B class sites and C class sites like Bovada and stuff like that. Like even at 1020, I feel like the defense rate here is just poor for in position in this line when reopening. Like I constantly see guys just like not even thinking about calling with stuff like low pocket pair at any frequency. Another option that you have as far as procedural tools is to add different sizings. You might find that there's a really good price point for a 1.5 overbet in some spots, it's got some metagame embedded into it because when you do something like polarize with a 1.5 bet, it plays into the perception of how your range is perceived in terms of like what you can rep at that point. So it could work both ways. Like there are players in the environment that will just massively overfold, like some guys that will like fold ace-x here versus an overbet consistently, which is just really bad, versus like 150% overbet. And then there's guys who will read into the overbet, who are lower level thinkers, and they'll be like, wait, he's polarizing, and I feel like he's trying to push me off the hand, and they'll still bluff catch you relatively enough. It's more of like that irritated bluff catch that comes from those types of lower level thinking players, and they're just like, they're not able to put you on a hand really, and they just don't believe you, more or less, is the vibe I get from them. Then there's the higher level thinking players who will also bluff catch adequately, and their reasoning is probably more sound in the sense that it actually functions from more range versus range awareness, where they're probably recognizing that they're decently capped and they know what their defense sort of has to look like in order to make sure they're not exploitable versus that overbet. And they might also know that you're a thinking player who's trying to exploit a capped range, so they either call enough or too much. So knowing the breakdown of your alias is kind of important for just sending off these type of exploitative flares blindly. But obviously having unique player notes can really help you with how often you want to pressure these spots abusively versus certain guys. I would say that versus the unknown players, like, or just the general poor thinker regs, like especially the passive regs, these are spots that you kind of want to abuse on a regular basis, probably just with a 2/3 bet. At least be betting substantially too much. And I think that's kind of important because I don't think enough emphasis is put overall on how much of your win rate comes from beating like the bottom 50% of the player pool in your environment. And so a lot of my strategies are devised to be sustainably exploiting that tier of the player pool because that's where it's most relevant for me to generate win rate. Again, I think it goes back to the overall environmental paranoia that they don't want to play an exploitable strategy because it might be re-exploited, but I'm more worried about just cutting it up and getting my win rate as high as possible. And if I am getting countered by 5% of the best regs at my limit, cool, they can take advantage of me for a little while until I realize what they're doing, and I will realize what they're doing eventually because I pay attention. So it's not something that concerns me because I see the higher benefit in devising strategies that exploit overall alias environments as opposed to worrying about who might figure out what I'm doing and hard counter me. That requires a certain amount of trust. I trust that I'm aware enough to know who's going to play back at me and that I can pretty much feel that and see indications of that with the types of strategies that they're combating me with. It might take me getting to showdown or me feeling that their aggression is being ramped up versus me or their bluff catching is getting ramped up versus me. But I will feel it eventually. And I think that it's a small price to pay for the extra win rate I get from applying these over aggressive high red line strategies, I guess is what you would call them. I've said before that I think that the environments encourage you to have a high red line. It's because they're overfolding in a lot of these spots. We're not playing for red line as a system, more or less, but our system has been incentivized toward high red line. It's kind of that same idea that MDF or 1 minus A frequencies are not like naive or static in nature. They are actually always the effect of a model that's been iterated to equilibrium. So let's keep cruising along here, check out some more turns, make sure what I'm saying is relatively consistent. So for the 10 here, it's going to be better for out of positions range than other cards. If we take a look at the EV, we're at 197, so this is actually a decent way to assess different turns in terms of your overall aggression, and it can give you insights into how MDF challenged in position is going to be if his range interacts fairly poorly with the river. It also kind of helps our sell, more or less. Like we can sell better that we pick something up on the river because our base rate kind of goes down on a 10 substantially. We can pick up 10x type hands, we can pick up 2 pair, we can pick up queen jack straights. So it's harder for him, I think, to justify that we have enough naked bluffs here, even though we probably very easily could. It just looks like it's more of a river that connects. So one thing we can do to sort of toggle through that is we can see that, remember when we had the average of out of positions EV going to the river after in position checks back, That's what this is when we're highlighted on the check node. It's showing us the EV at the point of which in position has checked back the turn, so before any river, and on account of that is the average of all rivers. So we're looking at 187.85 as the average. The 10 is slightly above that at 197, so it's an above average river for out of position. And we can sort of toggle through, since we can't do it with the aggregational report because we don't have the right locks, we can do it manually and just sort of get an idea. Looks like the low cards are going to be better for out of position because they just don't interact at all with within positions range, so he doesn't pick up any nutted distribution more or less, or any hot and cold advantage. If we get more up to like a 7, that's a card where in position actually improves disproportionately to out of position. Again, this is the way that I want you to start to think about range versus range interaction. Is like it's not really about who hits what, because sometimes both sides will hit a card, but it's about who hits what disproportionately hard relative to the opponent. So when I say that in position, this is a better card for in position, it's already taking into account how it affects out of position relatively. So 169 here, we can take a look at why. It's because the 7 interacts quite nicely with in position's nutted distribution. Picks up a decent amount of 2 pairs, sets, the a7 and king 7. He's still required to do a fair amount of bluff raising here, but I mean he's able to fold a decent amount of his 9x, which is not too sweet. I mean I would still pressure this range in the sense that yeah, it's kind of not cool that he's allowed to fold some king x, but he's still felting shreds of 8 6s and 5s, which I think will be overfolded to 5-4 suited too. I think the main advantage you have here again once again is that he's not going to be bluff raising nearly enough, and it's going to require him to call with more hands that he was using as bluff raises. So just a quick little like theme there in terms of a lace of how to help you guys start to identify what rivers you might want to pressure more. I think it's a good idea for at least selling your bluffs more, to pressure the cards that you're at a range advantage on that also happen to be the cards where it makes more sense that your base rate Bayesian bluff is lower. So pushing a little bit of equity on the jack, and it's above average, about the same as the 10. And queen is even a little bit better for us. Let's check out like a king or an ace. King looks like it's a little bit better for in position, but let's take a look at his defense. See, these are the type of spots where in position might be protected by trips, and it might be a slightly better card for him, just in terms of RVRI, but it might also require him to felt a wider range of bluff catchers than he may be comfortable with. So I think that's what's going on here, is we're seeing he's got to felt a little bit more pocket pair region. He's still folding a decent amount of 9x, which I don't like, so I'm not so sure that I'm overall happy about bluffing this texture. One thing that we do have going for us again is that he's required to bluff raise a lot in order to hit these frequencies, and I think a lot of guys will miss that. So that's definitely a reoccurring theme here. So one thing I was just doing when I had it on pause was I was going through again and I was looking at the overall fold frequencies as I changed the river, and it's holding pretty steady between like 42 and 44 for all rivers. So no real big takeaways there. The overall lace that I want you guys to take away from this, it's more of a tactical lace, because since we've done such dense research at this point on procedure, it can start to get a little bit more effortless. That's what you're going to notice for the rest of the pack, is that we've done the hard dense work already, so that we can just keep applying the same procedures that we're already familiar with to pretty much investigate where we want to get the best lacing tactics now. It'll also still be an exercise in drilling range versus range interaction in certain formations, but again, that's something that I expect you guys to go off and do on your own in groups and regiment time for daily, because that is the main thing that's going to get you better at that, is if you really set that hour or hour and a half or 2 hours aside, 5 days a week, and putting 10 hours of study into grids in terms of studying range versus range interaction, not memorizing frequency grids. Like I said, don't do it the stupid way, do it the smart way, and you can study for 10 hours a week and get more out of your study time than somebody who studies for 40 hours a week in a more irrelevant fashion. That's how I got really good really quick, and it made it seem like I was accomplishing a lot in a little bit of time. It's because I was working relevantly. It's a really cool thing when you can start to work less and know that you're accomplishing more than your competition, who might actually be working harder than you. It feels like freedom, and it feels like you've actually earned your freedom because you know that you're going about your life intelligently and you're prioritizing your time and you're prioritizing your relevance. In a lot of ways, they're the same thing. Okay, I'm going to call this one here, and we're going to come back and we're going to get into another texture finally, where we're going to look at some other concepts and how they arise with us using front door aggression now on the turn, because for one, we're sort of more incentivized to due to the nature of the texture and the range versus range interactions as the turns fall. And it's also going to sort of balance our system out because now we're someone who's also using front door aggression with value. This was just a unique texture, pretty much the only one I think. A bunch of different ace highs we will check range on the turn, um, despite those little tactical aces where we'll be playing bluffing ranges on like the ace and the nine. That stuff will always sort of be going on all textures where there may be specific cards that you bluff more often. But for the most part, this was the one texture that was very unique in the sense that I am recommending checking range in the turn. And I want you guys to sort of see how the system is going to converge toward balanced turn c-bet frequencies overall, and how it's going to get more undetectable as we're able to show our opponents that I think on the board we're going to look at 9-5 deuce. So on a lot of different turns, we're still barreling over pairs, and we're showing them that our strategy is not so hot and cold. It's not so lights out, night and day, where we always either check range or bet range on the turn with bluffs. We can mix it up, and we're doing that intelligently based on what range versus range interaction is incentivizing. So I'm happy with it because I found a way to monitor the overall turn c-bet frequency while doing it in a way that was incentivized by range versus range interaction. And I feel like that's kind of the highest balance when searching for exploitative options. So see you back for the next one.